Fantastic. Thank you very much, Robert. That was fantastic. As Robert said, when you look at us on the stage, you are looking into the past. We are the past, and when I look out at you, we are looking at the future. And that is why it's such a privilege to be here, and it's so exciting to share my thoughts with you. Now, those come with a health warning, of course, and the health warning is that I do represent the past. It is now over 25 years since I left medical school, which is a frighteningly long time. And of course, as a good scientist, when I offer my hints and tips to you, I'm acutely aware that they represent the choices that I made and the outcome of the choices that I made that ended up in the wonderful job and the wonderful life I think I have. But that wasn't a prospective randomized controlled trial in which we compared 1,000 proto-Geraints who all made the same life choices. It is possible that people who made all of those life choices all ended up as happy and perhaps as successful as I think I might be. But equally, it's possible that 999 of them are miserable and depressed and have a terrible life. So bear that in mind as good scientists when I talk to you about things I think are important, that I may be wrong, just as anyone who offers advice in good faith may be wrong. You're going to have to make up your own minds. And many of you, I hope, are going to find resonance with some of the things I say, but some of you are going to disagree with some of the things you say, and that is okay. There is diversity in this audience, and there is diversity throughout clinical academic medicine, and that's a good thing. So make up your own minds, and I'm going to give you some hints and tips about how I think you might be able to enjoy your MedSci life. I should also say in parenthesis that slightly transparent is I enjoyed that, but it's fair to say the rest of my family had a rather different experience of that particular bit of MedSci life. Right, so let's orient you. That's who I am. I work most of my time here in the Wellcome Trust Centre for Neuroimaging in Queen's Square. I also have an office just a couple of doors down at the Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience, also in Queen's Square, that I used to direct. I have a whole load of wonderful people. This is just a selection of some of the people in my research groups, past, present, and past, that I have the privilege to train and interact with. And I do what to most of you is incomprehensible brain imaging, looking here at the back of the occipital lobe, or equally incomprehensible connectomics, looking at neurodegeneration in Huntington's disease. Now, I am not going to talk to you about that today. I'm going to talk to you more about the business of putting together a clinical academic career and some of the things I think will be useful. I can bore you to death on another occasion about brain science and neuroimaging. So let's orient you a little bit more in a standard way. This is what you'd kind of normally expect in a medical talk. Somebody will start by essentially reading out their CV, and I'm going to do a little bit of that for you now. So a very long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, I emerged from a boys' school and went to medical school. I went to Cambridge, which gave me a little bit of time to recover, and then on to Oxford, which gave me even more time to recover. And after house jobs, I came to London. I went round what was then and now called the Golden Triangle. I went to Hammersmith, then the Brompton, then Tommy's ITU, and then to Queen's Square, all going tremendously well. I was lucky enough to be funded by the Wellcome Trust to do a PhD in what is now the Wellcome Trust Centre for Neuroimaging. And then rapidly I progressed because it went rather well. I was lucky enough to publish several papers in Science, and I went to Caltech in Southern California in Los Angeles for a couple of years on a Wellcome Trust-funded advanced fellowship. And then returning and doing a little bit of registrar training, I had the opportunity to apply for a clinical fellowship. And as a registrar, I was awarded a Wellcome Senior Clinical Fellowship, which I've held continuously ever since. Became a consultant shortly after that at University College London Hospitals. Then I was made a professor at UCL just early on in my career, and became director of the ICN in 2009, as you've just seen, and then Dean of Life Sciences in 2014. An inexorable progression from medical school to the current situation. Now, I hope that makes some of you feel a little bit intimidated, perhaps, depressed, perhaps, and I did it for a reason. And the reason is all of us in our position have spent most of our lives constructing stories like that. All of us as senior scientists have filled in a box saying, please summarize your career to date, including key achievements. And we have spent inordinate amounts of time trying to use the retrospectoscope to reformat our life into some inexorable chain where the only thing you could possibly believe is that everything in my life had been intimately arranged to allow me to be standing here today as a senior scientist telling you about how things are. So don't be fooled is the first thing. Remember, people always reconstitute their CV-based life. Now, that's just one story then about my life, and I could tell you a very different story. So I could tell you a story that began in Cambridge, where I didn't really know what to do, but met an incredible person at my college called Roger Carpenter, who wrote upside down in tutorials, had a fantastic textbook about physiology, and really inspired me to think about the brain. And probably more than anyone else, he's the person I would credit with a career in neuroscience. And then I could tell you about the confusion I had as an SHO when I, for some random and inexplicable reason, thought I wanted to be a renal registrar. At some point, I thought immunology was an interesting topic. It is, by the way, just not for me. And for some inexplicable reason, I applied to be a renal registrar and didn't get the job. This was a tragedy. Why had I not got the job? Why had the committee not found that? And I was dispatched to see somebody I'd never met before called Mark Warport, who was a consultant there, who basically told me to calm down, stop being so arrogant, think about what I wanted to do, and it would all be all right. Of course, he doesn't quite remember it that way, but that's how I remember it, and it was some of the best advice I'd ever given. I went off and became a neurology SHO and realized that actually neuroscience was the right thing for me to do. Then bumped into this man at Queen Square, who a lot of people said was an interesting neurologist, and he pointed me in the direction of this much more interesting person, Chris Frith, who I had coffee with and talked about whether whales were conscious. I got a parking ticket, but I was hooked and ended up doing a PhD with him, and he remains firm friends, Chris and Uta, to this day. And that took me to California, where the wonderful Christoph Koch on the right introduced me to the equally wonderful Francis Crick, with whom he had, as you know, a dyadic scientific relationship, as Francis Crick did throughout his scientific career. And I had the privilege of spending some time with them. And then back to London, where an equally wonderful man, the late John Driver, looked after me and really gave me a boost in my early days, not quite sure how to build a group or how to go about doing science. And that's before we talk about the people I met along the way, who I ended up married to, the rather difficult start to our first child, the slightly easier but nevertheless high-risk pregnancy of our second child, the wonderful people that I have met, a selection of whom are here, the 45 individuals I've trained so far over the last decade, and of course, it's all turned out very nicely at the moment for my wonderful family, and this is a selection of recent holiday pics showing Millie and Alex and my wife Rebecca. So this is a rather different story you've got here. It's not a story of posts and fellowships and CVs. It's a story of people and happenstance and good times and bad times. And that is going to be the story, like it or not, of your life, because it's the story of every one of us. We're in a people business. We're trying to be clinical academics because our motivation is to help our patients. We're university scientists and leaders because we're trying to train and help the next generation, and we're trying to lead people. And so that's a rather different story, I'd suggest, and it's a story that's very important to me and one that's animated most of my career to date, and I hope will continue to animate my career. So when we think about what you'll need for a clinical academic career in your situation, a conventional careers talk was going to talk about you need a plan, you need fellowships, you need papers, and no doubt those questions are at the forefront of your mind. What is my plan? How am I going to get the next fellowship? How do I write a high impact factor paper, etc., etc. Now, I'm not denying those are important things. Of course they are. But I'm going to suggest in the remainder of this talk, and I'm going to tell you a bit, that actually what you really need, first of all, as Tolstoy said, you need patience and time. He was referring to war, but I think it also, it's war and peace, by the way. But I think patience and time, your career unfolds over time. Your life unfolds over time. And what seems difficult or hard now may look different in the future. What seems bad now may look different in the future. It's also the case that what looks good now might seem different in the future. But the point is you need patience, you need to see it in the context of time, and I think above all, you need risk tolerance, because you are going to take risks. You're already taking a risk by what you're doing already, embarking upon a clinical academic career, and you're going to need resilience, because no one throughout their life has everything go right at all times. I start my grant writing workshops by asking everyone to stand up and then sit down if anything has ever gone wrong with their grants, with their lives, if they've ever failed at anything. And of course everyone sits down. Everyone fails at something. The important thing is how you respond to that and thinking about how you build resilience. So this is going to be the theme I will take up now for the rest of the talk. Some ideas, some thoughts. I want you to think about what I say, think about whether you agree with it or not, and think about what you're going to do today in this meeting, as well as in the longer term, to put some of those ideas into action. So there's 4 things I'm going to say. First thing, and there's method in my madness, by the way. These 4 things I've chosen because they represent some of the factors that people like you say are the most important in terms of barriers to progression or facilitators of getting there. I happen to think they're important too, and I want to give you my perspective on them. So people say when they're asked that intrinsic motivation is very important for clinical academic careers. I'll start wandering around just to confuse the live streamers now as well, I think. Intrinsic motivation means you like what you're doing. You're really passionate about what you're doing. It's intrinsically interesting to do academic medicine. Why is it interesting? Well, I think it's about the fact that we already know that it's quite exciting to do clinical work. That's helping patients. But research is even more exciting in my mind. As Albert Einstein said, if we knew what we were doing, it wouldn't be called research, would it? Research is intrinsically open-ended. Research is intrinsically going into the unknown. And done properly, you're finding out something that no one else has known before. Of course, what you're finding out might be boring or not interesting to everyone else, but it is what somebody has never known before. That's the post-Enlightenment approach that articulates why clinical academic careers are intrinsically motivating. So I encourage you just to think about that and then think about what your response would be to that. Maybe it's to go off and read something. Maybe it's to go off and talk to someone, to poke your nose in, to be interested in stuff. The whole point of being a scientist is to be interested in a lot of stuff, to focus that interest on what really is going to make a difference, and then to execute your plan. And that's the second part of intrinsic motivation, which is a degree of focus. I'm trained by the Wellcome Trust, and Mark Warport always used to say, and probably still does, what is your biological question, and why is it important? With apologies for my very poor impersonation of one of the country's most important scientists. It's a very, very important thing to think about what your question is, though. And I always say to people, just think about what a question is. So typical conversation goes like this. What is your question and why is it important? My postdoctoral fellow, my clinical fellow will say, well, I'm interested in autism and I want to look into this. And I'm like, stop. No questions there. Question is a sentence with a question mark at the end of it. And then we go through a process, as I have done all my life, of thinking, now what really is my question? And why is it important? How can I justify why it's important? These are quite useful disciplines, I'd suggest, to think about in terms of cultivating your inner motivation. It's not just about describing what you're doing. It's saying, what really is your question? And why really is it important to you, to the rest of the world, to everyone? The process is not about finding out the most important question. It's about finding out what matters to you and what motivates you, and being able to articulate that. And so I'd encourage you to think about that. If you can't write down right now what your question is and why it's important, I'd suggest you need to do a bit of time thinking. And also think about whether it really fascinates you. So we come into clinical academic practice with a lot of preconceptions about what's expected of us. The truth is, all that's expected of you, really, by people like Robert and myself in our leadership roles, is to do wonderful things. All that the Wellcome Trust expect you to do is find out some amazing stuff. But the preconceptions we come in with sometimes say, well, I ought to do that. I ought to be a renal physician, I thought at one point in my life. That wasn't right. Thinking seriously about whether that really is what you're passionate about is an important part. of intrinsic motivation. Now, there are other ways, apart from thinking about questions, that you can get intrinsic motivation. What's my intrinsic motivation? Well, part of it is through training and leadership. So this is a selection of people at the Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience, the group leaders there, and you can see I'm amongst them. What a wonderful bunch of people. All of them, almost without exception, are smiling. They are happy scientists. Why are they so happy? They're happy because they're training people. Each of their labs is full of people being trained, and my lab was full of people being trained, and in my own way as director, I was helping train the group leaders. This is the second bit of intrinsic motivation about scientific careers I think is so powerful. What we leave behind, as Mark Walport also said in the fossil record, is not just the discoveries we've made, but the people we've trained. And being proud of those people and showing how motivated you are by helping with their training, by thinking, some of you are already training MSc students, some of you will be supervising PhD students, have research assistants. That is part of one of the joys and pleasures you can get out of your career. Another part of intrinsic motivation is how rich science is as a way to think about communicating and showing your passion and building your motivation through communicating to a whole variety of audiences. In contrast to the opportunities offered solely within the NHS, you've got the opportunity not just to communicate your science to a professional audience, but also to an enormous variety of people. And if you are like me and interested in poking your nose into all sorts of situations, then the opportunities are relentless and endless. I have selected a few of my favourite moments. For example, I did some consultancy for a rather dodgy Channel 5 game show, solely really so I could get my name on the credits so my children would be impressed. It was a bit of a sad loser kind of moment, but nevertheless, I enjoyed it and hopefully I gave some good advice. It is always a pleasure and a privilege being on a programme like the Today programme that you wake up every morning listening to, if you're part of the middle-class metropolitan liberal elite like I am. But being on a radio programme and seeing how a live programme works from the inside is amazing. I got a spin round the test track at McLaren in Guildford by my friend Vince Walsh, who took me down there to give some advice on consultancy. We were giving them some advice. But that was another exciting way in which I never thought cognitive neuroscience could lead you to being driven around a test track at 160, 180 miles an hour. It was pretty scary. I didn't like it at all. I'm not a car person at all, by the way. And I love the work I do as a consultant with DeepMind Health, bringing applied solutions in big data. So your life can take you everywhere. Your work can give you all of these opportunities, and that's some of the richness. I would encourage you to think about how you can exploit that. There will be individual things you'll want to do. Steve Jobs offers this quote, which is going back to the theme of thinking carefully about what you love and really being true to yourself. It is okay if you don't want to do translational medicine and you're a clinical academic. I can stand here and say that now, even as a welcome senior clinical fellow, because it is okay. It's okay to be a basic scientist. Some people sometimes feel that as a clinician, they have to. Now, if your motivation, of course, is absolutely focused on disease, that is brilliant too. But be true to yourself and don't end up in the situation of a few years down the line thinking, well, I wish I'd done that, or I wish I'd taken a different course, or maybe I should have been interested in something else. Try and think about that. Don't worry too much. Your interests will evolve over time. I find myself working in neurodegeneration and autism now, even as a person who spent large parts of their life looking at basic mechanisms in the human brain, and that's for all sorts of reasons. But I think it's important always to be in touch with yourself and to have insight into what's going on. The other thing in the Jobs quote that's important is to love what you do. And thinking about the difference between doing what you love and loving what you do, I think is important. There's an active part of loving what you do, where you look at what you're doing, where you think about what you're doing, where you reflect upon it, where you think, was that a good day? Did I enjoy that? What went well? What went badly? And I think that reflective part is also part of intrinsic motivation. Second thing then, speaking comes naturally to doctors, doesn't it? We talk all the time, always presenting to people on ward rounds, always making up summaries. And particularly early in your clinical academic career, you think it's all about pitching. I've got to go to the interview. I've got to make my case. I've got to get my grant. I've got to get my fellowship. Yes, absolutely. Communication is important. But so is listening. And certainly as I've got older and more senior, I've spent more of my time listening. And I think it's important because it's a way you can gain other people's knowledge and try and turn that into wisdom. One person you need to listen a lot to is just you. As you get busier, clinicians, clinical academics, everyone gets busier. You would not believe my diary. I probably wouldn't believe your diary. You know, everyone's incredibly busy all the time. Making time for yourself is actually probably one of the most important things to do. Time often on your own, just sitting there, just thinking. Sometimes not even thinking about something. You don't have to spend time just thinking about your career all the time or just thinking about your family. But listening to yourself and thinking about yourself and cultivating that insight, I think is very important. And certainly at the senior leadership level, the most valuable time I have is the time when I'm sitting doing nothing on my own. It's really hard to create, but when I get it, it's really, really helpful. Now, you're also going to listen to a lot of other people, aren't you? And in general, everyone you meet is going to claim to be an expert at clinical academic training. This is especially prevalent in hospitals, which of course are not normally full of clinical academic doctors, because the majority of people in the NHS are clinicians. That will not stop them having a very strong opinion on what you should do next, what the fellowship should be, what your career course should be, what your life should be. Doctors are just like that. We are very good at giving everyone else our opinions on just about everything. I think that's lovely and that's fantastic, but of course it comes with a health warning that their expertise isn't necessarily rooted in experience or wisdom. And so you're going to have to just sift all that advice. Well-meaning people will sometimes give you bizarre and conflicting advice that you will have to sort out. I was told, for example, by a very senior neuroscientist that I would absolutely love for my postdoctoral fellowship to go and work in Iowa. Now, having actually spent some time in Iowa, I can tell you that is only a very small number of things in the world I would like less than to go and work in Iowa. And that was advice given in good faith that I rejected. So you'll come across that, and you've got to have the courage to follow your gut feelings and your instincts, good cognitive neuroscience for that, about following your instincts, and parse that advice and sift that advice, and think about that. I think the other thing I'd say about expertise is often people think there's one person out there. Medicine operates on this sort of totemic individuals thing, right? I've got a very, very complicated case. There must be one doctor in this hospital. I've seen the TV series, can't quite remember what it is. I'll find that doctor, and that doctor will solve the differential diagnostic problem, and everything will be unlocked. If you take the same approach to your career and think there's one person out there who is going to be the person for you, they are going to give you the advice and solve your problems, I think you're going to be disappointed. It isn't like that. There aren't people like that out there. There are just a lot of people with really interesting opinions who you're going to collect the advice from and think about and make your own decisions. But listen to them. Robert has already said that mentoring is very important, and I just want to reinforce that message. You can get mentors all sorts of ways. The Academy scheme is brilliant, but equally, it is possible to get mentors by walking up to people at meetings and saying, "Hello, would you mentor me?" Although I'd advise doing a slightly more upbeat presentation, not that downbeat voice. That's how, for example, many of my mentees have come along. It's not encouragement, by the way, although you're welcome to talk to me later. Informal mentoring is as important as formal mentoring, and of course, it's also just about network. At some point, the distinction between formal mentor and professional advice becomes a bit blurred. The more you can use meetings like this to talk to people, to network, it's not about getting on, it's not about making contacts who are going to open doors. It's really about having people who you can ask advice, get opinions from, and think about your career in your way. Right, now we're on to the serious stuff. Channel your inner bureaucrat. I'm a great believer in bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is your friend. A lot of people think bureaucracy is your enemy. It is out there to entangle you, to thwart you, But if you make bureaucracy and organization your friend, then this will empower you and enable you to have a successful career. It starts, as always, with you. One of the most difficult things I think about research is it has no organization. And so it can very rapidly start taking over your life if you have no time management skills, which most of us don't have. Most of us start off in our medical careers thinking, wow, you know, I'm just so good at time management because I'm a junior doctor, I'm a trainee doctor, I'm running around on ITU, I'm managing everything. But in fact, it's a pretty highly structured environment, right? You have outpatient clinics, you know when to turn up, the patients are in slots, okay, they all turn up at the wrong time, or everything runs late, or transport isn't there, but you know, basically it's a structured environment. And when you can finally get all your tasks on the ward done, you can actually go home, and if you're not on call, that actually is it. But of course with research, it isn't like that. And this exactly exemplifies my PhD, where I started to think, ah yes, a PhD. So this is all about the work I do. And if I do more work, maybe I'll get more papers. So if I work on Saturday, that's more work, isn't it? So I can do more of my PhD and get more papers. And that's really good because that might get me a fellowship. And then I started working more and more and more. And then I started noticing, actually, I was really not very happy. And actually, my girlfriend was really not happy. And many other bad things started happening connected to that in a fairly obvious and predictable way. Unfortunately, that pulled me back in the first year of my PhD and made me realize I had to be a little bit more structured and think about my own time management, be a little bureaucrat inside my own head about what time was what. And while you can overstate that, I think it's quite important to think about how your life is progressing. As you get older, many of us are really curious individuals. And this is the real challenge. Once you've got your PhD, now you're curious about everything. Gosh, I could be a postdoc. Gosh, I've got to finish my clinical training. There's this is interesting. I could do this. I could have these collaborations. Oh, I could do this. Curiosity means you have more things to do and more stuff you're interested in than there is time to do. I think I finally realized that probably in the last, I don't know, 6 months. That there is more stuff to do than time available. And I am interested in more stuff. And I'm sure you are too. And learning how to say no, learning how to organize things, learning that it's okay sometimes not to do things. You don't have to rush at every chance. You don't have to rush around like a crazy, crazy, crazy person trying to do everything, is actually an important part of not only being successful, but also being happy in your life. But also there's the external bureaucracy, isn't there? So here's a random organogram I pulled off Google of the NHS structure as it was, a mere 4 years ago. I'm sure it's got more complicated then. This is the structure that many of us live our lives in every day. And there's a very practical bureaucratic problem for most of you, which is how do I get time out of program? That is probably the quintessential practical bureaucratic problem of our day. It will befuddle many of you. There's forms to fill in, there's TPDs to talk with, and as you get more senior, it will only get more complicated because, surprisingly enough, you're going to want to do interesting things. You're going to want to do unusual things. You're going to want to do things that are slightly against the rules, like drop to less than full time, or do that, or do this, or do something. It's bound to happen. Trust me, I've trained and interacted with many people in your situation. Where knowing about the bureaucracy, I'm not suggesting learning this organogram, but I am suggesting learning about those things, cultivating those contacts helps you, is it enables you to overpower the bureaucracy and to prosecute the clinical academic career that you want rather than that somebody else wants. Because you're all kind, good, nice, honest, GMC, good medical practice, abiding people, and it's about making the system work for you. One of the most important tips in terms of making the system work for you is to think always about solutions, not problems. We are all extremely good at knowing what the problem is. And scientists are even worse. I have a whole faculty full of scientists who are absolutely brilliant at analysing the particular problem with what UCL is doing or what the dean is doing at any particular time. And they're also very eager to communicate with me why that is a particular problem and exactly why they are annoyed about it. What they are less good at is actually understanding what the solution is. And what you find particularly when you take up leadership positions, is when people bring you solutions to problems, and that is just an amazing thing, and it is the easiest thing to say yes to. Now, we won't necessarily have as extreme a reaction as the 26th president of the United States there, saying it's whining. But I think the important thing is, say you've got a particular issue with UPA. If you can think of a solution to that, you can put together the pieces and then go to the requisite people and say, I've got this solution, I think this might work. that is a really helpful thing to do, both for you in terms of thinking about it and for them in saying yes, essentially. So overcome bureaucracy with solutions. Right, we're nearly there. Final thing I'm going to talk about is work-life balance. Comes out again and again. Every single person I've mentored, there's been a conversation at some point about this. Every single survey that's ever done about clinical academic careers, and indeed, that is why MedSci Life and campaigns like that are being created, to talk a little bit about that. I think it's important to say it's hard. It is always hard to balance work and life, particularly for successful people. You are all successful people and you will all be successful people, and so it is going to be hard and you are going to have to work at it. And it will change over time because your priorities will change over time. That's what I mean by patience and time. Who you are in your 20s is not exactly who you are in your 50s, and things will change over time. There is some good news, though. One of the most good pieces of news is that really I'd see it the other way around. You have a life. I would say, actually, by the way, I would say if you haven't got a life, you definitely need to leave now and get one. But you've got a life, and it's the work that gets fitted in around the real stuff you do. I know it's not quite like that, and it isn't for me. I'm passionate about the work I do, and I love the job I have. I happen to think the job I have right now is the best job in the world, and I hope the next job I have will be the best job in the world too. But work fits around your life, and the funders, bless them, they really don't care how you organise your life. Funders are never in the business of saying, well, are you working on this 3 days a week or 4 days a week or 5 days a week? They don't really care. What they really care is, have you done something excellent with their money? Have you done something transformational with it? And if you happen to have done that in the evenings and the weekends, part-time, not part-time, it really doesn't matter. Say a few things and put a few gratuitous photos up of my children, as this is MedSci Life. And I'm a man, a white man, so at the wrong side of intersectionality. But I think it's incumbent to say a few things about that. People often fret. Not everyone in this audience will either want children or will have children. But for those that do, it is common to worry a lot, not just about your children. As a parent, I can say you worry all the time about your children, but to worry about when. I think what I would say, based on my experience and that of others, is there is never a good time. And when you think it's a good time, as the slide on the left shows, it suddenly turns rather unexpectedly into a not-so-good time for about 3 months in that case, 99 days on the neonatal ICU before Millie was discharged, completely out of the blue and unexpected. So I went from being a successful Wellcome Senior Fellow, just about to start my world-leading research into consciousness. Perhaps we were going to buy a house in Chiswick, you know, and you know, have the baby. The third trimester was going to be fantastic, but the third trimester didn't happen at all. And that was a very difficult time, as you can imagine. So you're catapulted suddenly into real life, the life that patients experience every day. It all, of course, as you can see from the slides, turned out very well for us in the end. It needn't for other people, and I'm sure it won't. I think the point is, there is never a good time. Even when you think it's a good time, it can change. So follow your heart here. The most important thing is your life. The work fits around that. You're going to have to work hard to balance the two. There's no doubt about that. But you can make it work. In that case, I would say that experience made me a much better dad than I would have been otherwise. Work does sneak up on you, though. It tends to integrate it, and you tend to start cheating and saying, well, actually, this is really family life, when actually you're sitting on your laptop doing your emails, or you're sitting on your laptop working in the kitchen, and then suddenly your entire work and life is horribly blurred. Thinking about those boundaries, I think, is quite important. So, for example, I don't send emails at weekends now. I do read my email, as my wife will tell you, incessantly at weekends, but all of the emails get put in a draft box and get sent on Monday morning. That's obviously, there are exceptions, emergencies, chaos, disaster, but the vast majority of them have done that. Now, that's a little solution that worked for me. I don't know your situation, but think about those little things and what are your boundaries in terms of what you allow to intrude. Timing. This sort of comes into work-life balance as well. So here's a sort of caricatured, you know, the stuff you need to do clinically, the stuff you need to do scientifically, and some of the stuff, again, your mileage may vary. Maybe you don't want a relationship, maybe you don't want a house, maybe you don't want children, but I've just put up one example life pathway there. And of course, there are other scientific pathways other than being a PhD, then doing a postdoc, then becoming a senior lecturer. But the basic challenge you've got in your life is how do you fit all those things alongside each other? And should you do it sequentially, or what's the timing, and so on? Again, I don't have any answers for you on that. I mean, I have opinions, but I think the thing I would say is they're aligned there for a good reason, because they're probably all going to take place at the same time. And you can fiddle with it in terms of saying, well, maybe I'll put my PhD off until I've almost done with my higher training. That's fine. It's just like saying, well, maybe I'll have children because I'm in a stable relationship and I want children early. Or maybe I'll wait till I'm a bit older. All of those choices are fine. But I think you need to recognize that choices have consequences. You don't need to plan all the time, but if you do leave your PhD, let's say, to a year before CCT, that's absolutely fine. You can do your PhD after CCT. NIHR will fund you. But there will be consequences to that. It will be harder, for example, to get funding, because fewer funders will fund post-CCT, certainly. Not all. And it will be harder to get your postdoctoral training in. That's fine if you recognize it. It's a bit like saying if you have children early on, when you're an SHO, if you're just graduated from university, your children will leave home at an earlier age than if you have children later. This is just how life works, right? Time is linear, and these things happen. I think the most important thing, though, is just to think about the consequences of your choices in terms of those timings. Because it's when you don't think about the consequences of those choices that things go wrong. People say, but nobody ever told me, you know, it would be harder to do a PhD once I was a consultant. I think there's plenty of advice about it. Now, your circumstances will vary, but just think about that and think about the time. You've got a lot of time, right? You've got a whole career ahead of you. So how you order it is up to you, but choices have consequences. And resilience. Final slide of an actual living scientist, not looking as glamorous as he thinks he is when he's out running. But look, it's blurred, so I must be running fast. So, you're going to need to build resilience through your career. Because, as I said earlier, it's not the case that everything is going to go right all the time. For me, running. I am the least athletic individual you would have ever met at medical school and subsequently. I have no interest whatsoever in sport. There, I can confess it on a live stream. I'm not interested in football. I don't like cars. I would sooner go handbag shopping than any one of those things. But why did I take up running? Well, I think some of it was the incipient fear of, you know, getting a bit older, losing the ability to regulate your calorie intake because you have too many cocktail parties to go to, and the incipient fear of death when you're a middle-aged man by cardiovascular status. So I thought I'd best do something. It has been, for me, incredibly important. In terms of my senior leadership, where I get my resilience from is by going out running a lot, in the dark, in the cold. Running tights like those, amazing things. Amazing, amazing things that men have never experienced before. Leggings, essentially. They keep you really warm in the winter. So for me, that's been really important. I've gone up to competitive 10Ks, I've gone up to a half marathon, and I stopped there because I really couldn't fit marathon training in my schedule without impacting upon my family. And I love doing that. That's parkrun. That's my local parkrun. My goal is to get to my 50th parkrun before my 50th birthday. And currently I'm on track to achieve that later this year, both of those later this year. And for me, that does it. Now, your mileage will differ. But I do want you to think, where do you get your resilience from? Is it other people? Is it cooking? Is it sailing? Is it, any one of the impossibly glamorous pursuits that have been illustrated by the MedSci life slides to date? Including that sort of balletic pose of that individual. It doesn't matter, but I think you do need to think about what gives you resilience, and you do need to encourage that, because that's going to help you in your career and in your work-life balance. Okay, almost done. So I may have frustrated you by not talking about how to get a fellowship or how to get a grant. That's another talk. But what I have done is I hope I've told you some things about why it's important to do these things, why these will help you overcome the barriers that you are all going to face, because they're common barriers we all face as we go along in our careers. You've got to cultivate your intrinsic motivation. Think about what you do, love it every day, love it some more. You've got to listen to people and gather a lot of information and think about how that impacts upon you. You've got to become a ninja in the bureaucracy sphere, both of personal organisation and of organising other people. They're not going to do it for you, but you are. And you're really going to, I hope, think very hard about how you're going to effect a positive work-life balance. What one change in your life can you make right now that would improve things? Go ahead and do it. That's fine. And that will lead to you becoming tolerant to risk, resilient to change, or disaster or bad things happen to you. And that will be the legacy that will help you have an immensely successful career. Now, when you've done all that, you're going to have an absolutely wonderful time. And many of you will have done most of that and will be having a wonderful time. So I just want to finish by just celebrating what's absolutely wonderful about clinical academic careers. For me, the most important thing is autonomy and freedom, to choose what I do, when I do, the science I do, the things I do to channel my career. Nobody is telling me what to do. Nobody is telling you what to do. You're finding it out. And that is an amazing thing that comes very early on in an academic career. Even at the earliest stages, you get autonomy and freedom in your taste of it. It's a wonderful time to be doing academic medicine in Britain. That sounds an odd thing to say. We've got Donald Trump, we've got Brexit, we've got all sorts of bad things happening. Here's a tweet, though, that just a recent tweet from the UK consulate that just reminds us just how good science is in the UK, and there are many others like it. It's an amazing way to travel the world, to meet new friends, to influence people, but most of all, to make a difference. And that will carry on being the case regardless of what happens in terms of external threats. Your career has amazing opportunities, and you will fulfill most of those opportunities because you're starting from an incredibly strong base. Here's a sample of, the kinds of things that you will get used to living through. These are the kinds of things in my life. This is just a random year picked out of 5 years. So the variety is incredible. I spent a lot of my time in this rather dingy venue in South London a few years ago with the Department of Health and accompanying friends on modernising medical careers and things like that. It was fascinating. It was interesting. I spent a lot of time on the bottom deck of this at the back trying to get to the top deck at the front and finally doing it. And it wasn't as exciting as I thought it was. It was a bit sad, really, when I finally got the rear-facing seat at the front of the upper deck. It wasn't very exciting. And now I'm back in the back end of it, as usual. But you get to fly the world. Here's a few of the venues I've been to. You work in these wonderful places, you find out wonderful things, you train wonderful people, and you have access to as many laptops as you want. Because that is the productivity tool du nos jours. It's an amazing variety of life, and each bit of that is under my control. No one is telling me what to do, and I have the autonomy and freedom and the privilege and responsibility of carrying out that sort of a career. And you get to put together the most amazing programs with the most amazing people. Here's a slide pulled out of a recent site visit from my Wellcome Trust Centre, where I was presenting my particular work program, which, as you see, I haven't given you the lecture of extremely boring multivariate analytics applied to brain connectomics. But the main thing, again, is you meet the most wonderful people from the most interesting backgrounds who you can then work with on the most interesting problems, as you can see in this case, a combination of autism, neurodegeneration, and big data analytics. So I'm going to finish with this slide and just say, but the real privilege of all this is being able to work alongside the most amazing colleagues. This is a selection, some of whom you'll recognize, at least one of whom is in this room and about to speak, that we put together at UCL. There will be examples in your own institutions. Every institution has role models and colleagues. I end with it because it really makes the point that diversity is what makes up science. The inclusivity of science is that we are all doing the same thing with the same goals in mind, but the diversity is something that is wonderful. And it means that each of you have the opportunity to put together your individual MedSci life, your individual career plan around those basic goals, and have a wonderful, wonderful career. I'm going to end there. Thank you very much.